Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a truly pivotal idea. I mean, one that has profoundly shaped how people talk about global politics for decades now.
Absolutely. We're talking about Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations.
Right. And this wasn't just, a book that appeared overnight. It started as a lecture back in 92.
Yeah, a Bradley lecture. Then it became this hugely debated article in Foreign Affairs in 93, and finally the full book came out in 96.
And it really made waves everywhere, didn't it? Argentina, Japan, Saudi Arabia. People were talking about it globally.
They really were. It clearly struck a chord, or perhaps a nerve, depending on who you asked.
So our mission here is to really pull out the key ideas from this, pretty influential work. We want to help you understand the core arguments, maybe some surprising insights, and importantly, why it still feels relevant today.
Definitely. And Huntington's starting point was this idea that the world map was changing after the Cold War. The old divisions, free world, communist bloc, third world, they just didn't fit anymore.
So what replaced them in his view?
He argued that the really big conflicts, the most important and frankly dangerous ones, wouldn't be about social class or economics anymore.
Not the haves versus the have-nots, or capitalism versus communism.
No. He argued they'd be between peoples belonging to different cultural entities, civilizations, essentially.
Different cultural entities.
Yeah.
So where do these clashes actually happen? He had a specific term for that, didn't he?
He did. He talked about the fault lines between civilizations. That's where he saw the greatest danger.
Fault lines, like geological fault lines, where the pressure builds up.
Exactly. And conflicts along these fault lines are perilous because they can escalate. Other countries, what he called kin countries, might rally to support their cultural brethren.
Can you give us an example? I mean, where have we seen this play out?
Well, think about the Balkans in the 90s.
Yeah.
Bosnia. Or conflicts in the Caucasus, Central Asia, Kashmir, maybe. These weren't just, local spats.
They had a bigger dimension.
Right. In Yugoslavia, you saw Russia generally backing the Serbs, who were Orthodox Christians like them. And on the other side, countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, they were supporting the Bosnians, who were predominantly Muslim.
And this support wasn't based on, say, political alignment or economic deals?
Primarily, no. Huntington argued it was driven by this cultural kinship. It really echoes what Václav Havel said, that cultural conflicts are increasing and are more dangerous today than at any time in history.
It really forces you to think differently, like the map you use changes the world you see and the predictions you make.
Totally. Take a standard realist approach to international relations. It focuses on states maximizing power.
Right. National interest, power politics.
Okay, so apply that to Ukraine after the Cold War. A realist might predict, inevitable conflict, maybe even Russian conquest. And the policy recommendation might be for Ukraine to get nuclear weapons for deterrence.
A very state-centric view.
Exactly. But Huntington's civilizational map gives you a different picture. It plays down the risk of a full-scale state-on-state war like that.
So what does it highlight instead?
It highlights the possibility of Ukraine splitting internally along that cultural fault line between its more Western-oriented parts and its more Orthodox Russian-oriented parts.
So a split maybe like Czechoslovakia, but potentially messier, like Yugoslavia, though maybe not as bloody.
Something like that. The point is, seeing it through that civilizational lens completely changes your policy priorities. It's not about nukes. It's about managing internal cultural divisions.
That's a really powerful illustration. But okay, to really get this framework, we need to nail down his core concept. What exactly was a civilization for Huntington?
He defined it as the broadest practical basis for human cultural affiliation. It's the biggest us that people identify with, culturally speaking.
The broadest level of identity beyond your nation or ethnicity.
Right. He said human history is the history of civilizations. They provide the broadest identifications for people. And this is based on shared stuff, values, beliefs, institutions, social structures, the whole cultural package.
Now, it's really important. You mentioned this earlier. He drew a line between civilization and race. They aren't the same thing in his view.
Absolutely crucial. He was very clear. Civilization and race are not identical. You can have people of many different races sharing the same civilization.
Like with major religions.
Exactly. Think about Christianity or Islam. They span societies with incredibly diverse racial makeups. The commonality Huntington focused on was shared values, beliefs, institutions, not physical appearance.
Okay. So, speaking of shared things, What about language? We see English becoming dominant globally. Does that push us towards one big global civilization? Does it blur those lines?
That's a common thought, but Huntington argued no. He saw English emerging as the world's main language of wider communication. LWC, he called it. It helps people from different cultures talk to each other.
But it doesn't make them the same culture.
Right. He said its use actually presupposes the existence of separate cultures. It's a tool. Like using the Christian calendar or Arabic numerals doesn't make you Christian or Arab. Speaking English is a way to cope with cultural difference, not erase it.
Interesting. So it might even reinforce separate identities in a way. You use English to communicate about your own distinct culture.
That's part of his argument. It facilitates interaction between distinct groups.
And within this framework, what did he pinpoint as the defining feature of Western civilization? What made it distinct?
For Huntington, the absolute core was Western Christianity. Initially Catholicism, and then after the split, both Catholicism and Protestantism.
So religion was central.
He called it the single most important characteristic. He also pointed to things like the Reformation and Counter-Reformation as really unique events shaping the West's historical path.
Okay, now let's get to one of his most, I think, provocative and maybe surprising ideas, this distinction between modernization and Westernization.
Yes, this is really central to the whole argument.
He basically said you can modernize without becoming Western. Why was that such a big deal? Because wasn't the assumption kind that modernization meant becoming like the West?
That was often the assumption, yeah.
Yeah.
But Huntington said, hold on. Non-Western societies absolutely can modernize, adopt technology, industrialize, educate their populations without throwing out their own values, institutions, and culture to adopt Western ones wholesale.
And he even argued that modernization could lead away from the West.
Exactly. This is the really interesting twist. He said, okay, maybe in the early stages, adopting some Western ways helps kickstart modernization. But later on, as societies get more powerful economically, militarily, politically, modernization actually fuels de-Westernization.
How does that work?
Well, as these societies become stronger and more confident, they tend to reassert their own indigenous cultures. They don't feel the need to emulate the West anymore. They feel pride in their own traditions and values.
Which connects to another striking phrase he used, la revanche de Dieu, the revenge of God. What's the link there?
The link is that modernization can be really disruptive. It breaks down traditional social ties, creates alienation, maybe an identity crisis. People feel adrift.
And religion offers an anchor.
That was Huntington's argument. Religion provides answers, meaning community things that might feel lost in the rush to modernity. So you saw this global religious resurgence in the late 20th century.
Example.
Well, the spread of Christianity in places like South Korea and China, the huge revitalization of Islam across the Muslim world, people reaching for emotionally satisfying faiths, sometimes even imports, if their traditional local beliefs didn't seem to fit the modern world anymore.
It's a powerful idea that modernization itself creates the vacuum that religion fills.
Right. And paradoxically, even radical anti-Western movements were using modern tools like email, cassette tapes back then, TV to spread their message. Modernization enabling the pushback against Westernization.
Wow. Okay, so this cultural resurgence is happening, but it's also happening alongside shifts in actual measurable power, right? Huntington talked about a relative decline of the West. What did he mean by that?
He pointed to concrete data. The West's share of key global resources, territory, population, economic output, manufacturing, military personnel, he argued it peaked somewhere in the early 20th century and has been generally declining since.
Any specific numbers?
Yeah. He cited figures like the West's share of world economic product falling from around 64% in 1950 down to 49% by the 1980s. And the projection he quoted saw it falling further, maybe to around 30% by 2013.
So a significant shift in economic weight. What about people, demographics?
Huge factor. He contrasted aging populations in the West, Japan, and Russia with much younger populations in many non-Western civilizations.
Younger populations meaning?
Meaning, as he put it, future workers and soldiers. He specifically highlighted rapid population growth in many Muslim countries, leading to a youth bulge.
And the significance of that youth bulge.
He saw it contributing to various pressures, providing recruits for fundamentalist movements, for terrorism, fueling migration flows. It treats social dynamism, but also potential instability.
And this connects to social mobilization, right? It's not just about numbers, but about capabilities.
Exactly. You have rising literacy, more education, increased urbanization across the non-Western world. This creates populations that are more aware, have higher expectations, and are easier to mobilize politically.
He had that example about Iran, didn't he?
Right. In 1953, the CIA could help orchestrate a coup against Mossadegh relatively easily, partly because Iranian society was less mobilized. Fast forward to 1979.
Totally different story.
Totally different. Higher literacy, more urbanized population, much more politically aware. No amount of U.S. backing could keep the Shah in power against that mobilized opposition. That's the difference mobilization makes.
So you have economic shifts, demographic shifts, increased mobilization,
Yeah.
leading to greater assertiveness from non-Western civilizations. Did he see this assertiveness playing out differently in different places, say Asia versus the Muslim world?
He did distinguish. He saw Asian assertiveness, especially East Asian, as primarily driven by incredible economic growth. Remember that Japanese journalist he quoted saying something like,
The days when the United States sneezed and Asia caught cold are over.
that's the one. Economic power fueling confidence and assertiveness. Muslim assertiveness, on the other hand, he linked more to that social mobilization and population growth we just talked about. Different drivers, but both challenging the status quo.
Okay, this brings us to another key concept, torn countries. What defines a country as torn in Huntington's view?
A torn country is one where the leadership is actively trying to shift the country's civilizational identity. They want to move it from one camp, basically, into another.
But it's not easy.
No, because there's usually significant resistance from within society. The elite might want to join, say, the West, but large parts of the population feel culturally aligned elsewhere.
And Turkey is often cited as the classic example, right?
The quintessential example. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Ataturk set Turkey on a firmly secular westernizing path. The post-Cold War elite largely followed that, seeking EU membership, staying in NATO.
But then things changed.
But then you had the resurgence of Islam becoming a major force in Turkish politics. Leaders started using more Islamic symbols. You saw the rise of parties like the Welfare Party in the 90s, winning major cities like Istanbul and Ankara, challenging that purely Western orientation, a real tug-of-war.
Was Mexico another case he pointed to?
Yes. He argued that in the early 90s, Mexico's leaders were making a conscious effort to redefine Mexico, moving it away from being just Latin American
And towards being.
towards being North American. Joining NAFTA with the U.S. and Canada was a key part of that strategy, an attempt to align Mexico economically and politically with the North, even if culturally there were, other strong ties and maybe some resistance.
Interesting. And Russia, of course, has this long history of debating its identity. How did Huntington see Russia fitting into this torn category after the Soviet collapse?
Well, you had President Yeltsin initially aiming to make Russia a normal country, part of the West, integrate with Western institutions.
But that wasn't universally accepted within Russia.
Not at all. Huge debate. You had figures like Sergei Stankovic arguing Russia wasn't just Western or Eastern, but had a unique Eurasian identity, emphasizing its connections to Turkic and Muslim cultures. Well, it goes back centuries, really, that internal struggle over whether Russia is primarily European or something distinct. Peter the Great kind of created a torn country.
It wasn't just nations with long histories of this, though. He even mentioned Australia.
Yeah, that one might surprise some people. But in the early 90s, he pointed to Australian leaders like Prime Minister Paul Keating making a deliberate pivot.
A pivot towards Asia.
Exactly. Talking about Australia needing to stop being a branch office of empire, become a republic, and really enmesh itself with Asia economically and politically, a conscious effort to redefine its primary orientation away from its historical ties to Britain and the West.
So we have these internal struggles in torn countries and then the broader friction points between the West and, well, the rest, as it's sometimes put. How did Huntington frame the West's agenda in this context?
He saw the West trying to maintain its dominant position through basically three main strategies.
Okay, what were they?
First, maintaining military superiority, particularly through things like non-proliferation efforts, trying to stop other powers from getting weapons of mass destruction.
Makes sense from a Western perspective.
Second, promoting Western political values, democracy, human rights, pushing them as universal values.
And third,
Protecting its own cultural and ethnic integrity, largely by trying to limit immigration from non-Western countries.
okay, so military dominance, value promotion, and border control. How did he see other civilizations reacting to this agenda? Let's start with the military and values parts.
Well, the non-proliferation stuff was often seen by others as basically hypocrisy, a way for the established powers, mainly the West, keep their advantage and prevent others from catching up. maintaining hegemony.
And the push for democracy and human rights.
That often ran into resistance, too. Many non-Western governments viewed it as human rights imperialism, the West trying to impose its specific values on everyone else. They'd push back, emphasizing their own indigenous values and traditions.
He mentioned China being effective at blocking Western initiatives on human rights.
Yeah, he noted that in the UN Human Rights Commission during the 90s, China was often successful in rallying other Asian countries to defeat Western-sponsored resolutions, criticizing its record, a kind of solidarity against perceived Western interference.
This leads to a really fascinating point. Huntington made a kind of paradox about democracy promotion after the Cold War.
Ah, yes. This is really insightful.
During the Cold War, the West often backed friendly tyrants, right? Authoritarian regimes that were anti-communist.
Right. Strategic allies, even if they weren't democratic.
But after the Cold War, the West started promoting democracy more actively, but then they ran into a problem.
Exactly. The problem was, in some non-Western societies, democratization didn't lead to pro-Western liberals taking power. Instead, it sometimes brought anti-Western nationalists or religious fundamentalists to power through the ballot box.
Like the example of Algeria in 1992.
Precisely. The Islamic Salvation Front, FIS, looked set to win the election, which alarmed both the Algerian military and the West. When the military canceled the second round of voting, Huntington notes, the West was basically relieved.
So the enthusiasm for promoting democracy kind of cooled when it produced results the West didn't like.
It revealed a tension, yeah. Promoting democracy was good unless it empowered groups seen as hostile to Western interests. It showed that strategic concerns could still override value promotion.
And the third part of the Western agenda, restricting immigration, he saw that as a major friction point, too.
A huge one. He described Western societies facing massive waves of non-Western immigrants. This fueled fears among some segments of the local populations.
Fears of being invaded.
That's the strong language he reported, feeling invaded. Not by armies and tanks, but by migrants who speak other languages, worship other gods, belong to other cultures.
And this demographic pressure turned immigration into a hot political issue.
Absolutely. Especially when combined with higher birth rates among some immigrant groups. It led to calls for much stricter controls, debates over multiculturalism, things like California's Proposition 187 in the U.S., aimed at cutting off services to undocumented immigrants, and broader policy shifts tightening immigration rules in the mid-90s.
Okay, shifting now to the actual conflicts along those fault lines, Huntington made some pretty blunt observations about where the violence was concentrated in the early 90s.
He did. Looking at the data from that period, he observed that Muslims were engaged in more intergroup violence than were non-Muslims.
Yeah.
He calculated that something like 2/3 to 3/4 of all the wars between civilizations at that time involved Muslims on one side.
Which led him to that very stark statement.
Islam's borders are bloody, and so are its innards. A very controversial statement, obviously, but it reflected his analysis of the conflicts happening then. He also noted Muslim countries generally had higher ratios of military personnel to population compared to Christian countries.
And he argued these fault line wars have a tendency to escalate identities, to become more polarized.
Yes, he described an identity war dynamic. Local conflicts get transformed. Each side starts emphasizing its own broad civilizational identity. We are Orthodox Christians, we are Muslims, and paints the other side as an existential threat.
Which then draws in outside support.
Right, it rallies the kin countries we talked about earlier. And sometimes diaspora communities living elsewhere get involved, often becoming even more hardline, he said, more Catholic than the Pope.
He used Russia's wars in Central Asia as an example.
Yeah, he mentioned Russia framing its interventions in places like Tajikistan and its war in Chechnya, not just as local issues, but as part of a wider defense of orthodoxy against radical Islam, defining the conflict in civilizational terms.
So in this multipolar, multi-civilizational world, you have these civilizations sometimes clashing. Do they have centers of gravity? Did he identify core state?
He did. He argued that some civilizations have clear core states that act as leaders or poles of attraction. The West obviously has the U.S. and key European powers. The Orthodox world has Russia. Cynic civilization has China.
What about Islam? Did he see a core state there?
That was a key point, he argued, that while Islamic civilization had a growing sense of common identity and consciousness, it lacked a single undisputed core state that could lead or unify the Muslim world in the same way the U.S. leads the West or China leads the Cynic sphere.
Interesting. And he saw connections forming between some of these civilizational blocks. specifically the Confucian Islamic connection.
Yes, this was a major part of his analysis of emerging alignments. He saw Sinic civilization, led by China, and various Islamic states finding common ground.
Common ground in opposing the West.
Largely, yes. Cooperating on issues where they disagreed with the West, like resisting pressure on human rights or democracy, and significantly, on weapons proliferation.
He pointed to specific military ties.
He highlighted the close military relationship between China and Pakistan, including allegations of China helping Pakistan with its nuclear program and providing missile technology. He saw this potentially extending to Iran as well, forming a sort of de facto anti-Western alignment on certain strategic issues.
And how did other big players like Russia and India fit into this picture?
Well, Russia, despite sometimes cooperating with China, fundamentally views the large and growing Muslim populations to its south as a long-term strategic challenge, even a threat.
So tensions there. And India.
India, he predicted, would likely remain locked in conflict with Pakistan, its main Islamic rival. And it would also be wary of China's growing power and influence in the region.
Which could push India
towards closer ties with the United States, potentially. Shared concerns about China and Islamic extremism could create a strategic alignment, overcoming some of the historical distance between Delhi and Washington.
So putting this all together, navigating this complex, multi-civilizational world, Huntington was pretty skeptical about the idea of a single universal civilization emerging, wasn't he?
Deeply skeptical. He directly challenged that idea. He called out the single alternative fallacy. Meaning the flawed assumption that just because Soviet communism collapsed, the only alternative left standing was Western liberal democracy, and that everyone would inevitably adopt it.
He argued there were other options.
Absolutely. He stressed that many other forms of government, many other cultural and religious alternatives exist and have deep roots. The idea that everyone who modernizes must inevitably become like us in the West, he called that a bit of Western arrogance.
Because Western values aren't necessarily universal.
He argued that core Western ideas like individualism, liberal democracy, human rights as the West defines them, they often have little resonance in many non-Western cultures, which might prioritize community, order, or different conceptions of rights and justice.
Okay, so if universalism is out and civilizational clashes are a real danger, how do we avoid major wars? Did he offer any rules for peace?
He proposed 3 basic rules, sort of guidelines for coexistence in a multi-civilizational world.
What's the first one?
The abstention rule. Core states, the leading states of major civilizations, should avoid intervening in conflicts happening within other civilizations.
Basically, stay out of other civilizations' internal squabbles.
Pretty much. A rule he suspected the United States, with its interventionist tendencies, might find particularly hard to follow.
Okay, abstention rule. What's second?
The joint mediation rule. When conflicts do break out along those fault lines between civilizations, the core states from the involved civilizations should negotiate with each other to try and contain or stop the fighting. Joint management, essentially.
And the third rule?
The commonalities rule. This is more proactive. Peoples in all civilizations should actively look for and try to expand the values, institutions, and practices they actually hold in common with others.
Finding common ground.
Right. He wasn't saying there's no common ground. He suggested there might be a thin, universal morality, basic prohibitions against murder, deceit, torture, things found across most major moral traditions. Focus on strengthening those commonalities.
Abstain, mediate, find commonalities. But he ended the book on a rather concerning note, didn't he? Something about the fading of civilization.
Yes, it's a quite somber reflection at the end. He raises concerns about a potential global breakdown of law and order.
What kind of breakdown?
Things like the rise of failed states, increasing anarchy, transnational crime, drug trafficking, a general weakening of social fabrics, even the family unit across the world.
Not just in developing countries.
No, he suggested these fundamental elements of what you might call civilization, with a capital C, basic security order, functioning institutions, seem to be eroding in many places and were under serious assault, even in developed societies like China, Japan, and the West itself.
A warning that the very foundations might be shakier than we think.
Kind of a warning that maybe the bigger threat isn't just civilizations clashing, but the potential unraveling of civilized order itself.
So where does that leave us? We've gone through Huntington's core ideas, this shift from ideology to culture, the fault lines, modernization versus westernization, torn countries, the West and the rest, these rules for peace. It's definitely a powerful, if controversial, framework.
It undeniably shaped debate for decades, and you still see echoes of it constantly in discussions about international relations, identity politics, global conflict. Whether you agree with it or not, it provides a distinct lens.
And the ideas, even though they're from the 90s, they still spark debate today about how accurate they were, what the implications are, which kind of leads to a final thought, maybe for you listening.
Yeah, if we are living in a world increasingly shaped by these deep cultural differences, and maybe, as Huntington worried, facing challenges to basic order, what's our responsibility?
Right. As individuals, as societies,
Yeah.
how do we navigate this? How much effort do we put into finding that common ground Huntington mentioned, working towards some kind of shared understanding, even amidst all the differences?